My name is Dorothy Williams, but everyone calls me Dot. I'm 67 years old, I live in Cedar Falls, and I've learned to speak softly to survive noisy days. After Harold passed away, the house became too big and the silence too heavy. My son, Marcus, said I'd better go there until I get things sorted. His daughter-in-law, Ashley, smiled with the air of a manager checking inventory. At first, it sounded like a close-knit family, a full table, the noise of grandchildren and brewed coffee, but I soon realized I'd become the coffee, the table, and the hand that washes the dishes. And besides, every month I gave $300 of my retirement to the house. I nodded, but inside I was counting the crumbs of my dignity. Ashley organized everything into spreadsheets, colors, goals, as if I were a department. She called it an expense agreement, printed it, stapled it, and asked for my signature. There was a line for food, a line for gas, a line for use of common areas. Even my time became a bill. Cooking, cleaning, picking up my grandson, all without a receipt. Marcus said he didn't want any trouble and disappeared into his room or at work. I turned the page in the recipe book and continued stirring the beans. At night, I lay down tired, prayed quietly, and kept my tears in the pillow. It wasn't just the service, it was the feeling of being a guest without a key. I was there, but like an object someone had pushed into a corner. One day, I heard the word basement used as a solution. Ashley spoke of a kitchenette, of giving me autonomy away from the living room. She said it would be more comfortable for everyone, with a firm smile. I understood they wanted me useful and invisible, like a clean floor mop. Marcus scratched the back of his neck and agreed with a, "Maybe it'll help, Mom." I felt my heartbeat in my ear, that thump-thump that precedes a decision. I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't dramatize. I just wrote the date on a piece of paper. When respect wanes, I increased the recording of what happened. I learned this from Harold. Facts save when memory fails. Every Friday, I bought a Powerball ticket at Murphy's Corner Store. The same numbers for 32 years. Wedding, Marcus's birth, our house. Jimmy, the cashier, would already separate the paper and ask about my day. I'd pay, put the ticket in my wallet, left side, zippered compartment. It was my little ritual of stubbornness and hope, something all my own. Even when life was trying to get me wrong, I held on to that little bit. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about remembering that I still had a choice. Some call it superstition. I call it a spine. The thing that keeps us standing when everything else bends us. That Friday, the sky was gray and the wind cut through the corner of Main Street. I bought the ticket, folded it once, zipped it up, and walked slowly back. At home, I finished a baked chicken, plain rice, and coleslaw. Ashley said, "Thank you, Dot," as if thanking the office assistant. The kids ate well. Marcus hurried out for a call. I washed the baking sheet, tidied the kitchen, and closed the door. In my room, I took out the ticket and checked the numbers on my phone. First, I looked wrong, then I took a deep breath and calmly repeated them. The numbers matched one by one like a medical exam. The screen said 53 million, and I sat there motionless. I didn't scream, I didn't jump, I didn't take a picture. I just leaned my back against the headboard. I checked another website, then the official app, then again. I grabbed a pen and wrote down the date, time, and link just in case. I grabbed a freezer bag and sealed the note inside. I put the bag inside a round cookie tin with a blue lid. I placed the tin at the bottom of my suitcase with my documents. I closed the suitcase and sat on the floor for a few minutes, breathing. I knew my life had turned a corner there. At breakfast the next morning, I simply said I had to leave later. Ashley showed me a management plan for my finances on paper. She showed statistics of failed winners, colorful graphs, deadlines. She said the ideal was to centralize everything to avoid emotional mistakes. Marcos spoke of family, of trust, of how we are a team. I listened and stirred the sugar in my mug, silent. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it. I just asked if they had just spoken. When they said yes, I told them the note was in my name and that, for now, nothing would be centralized outside of my head. Ashley's smile faltered and she asked if I understood the implications. She said she wanted to protect myself and that big decisions require collective action. I replied that big decisions require clear ownership and a lawyer. Marcus looked out the window and asked if I was offended. I said no, that I was paying attention, which is quite different. They talked about solving my housing situation once and for all with a good clinic. I replied that my permanent housing would be chosen by me, and that, for now, I had a meeting scheduled with David, the lawyer. I finished my coffee and calmly went to get my bag. In David's office, I sat in a chair that wasn't too tight. I told him about the note, showed him my notes, and handed him the cookie tin. He checked everything with gloves and explained annuity versus lump sum. We talked about taxes, deadlines, and the first steps to avoid mistakes. He recommended silence, discretion, and secure structures, trusts, and separate accounts. I agreed and asked that everything be in my name, without intermediaries. I asked about protecting my address and my routine from gossip. He smiled and said, "The internet travels faster than a love letter." I left with a short list. No comments, no signing, no compromises. The next day, I received a manila folder in Harold's handwriting. It was the dossier he sometimes talked about, just in case. Inside were receipts, contact information, and a report from a private investigator. Marcos and Ashley's debts were mapped as well as overdrawn credit cards. There was also a copy of a $500,000 trust to protect me. If there was exploitation or coercion, I would have immediate access and control. I cried alone, not from sadness, but from being cared for even afterward. I put the folder in the back of my closet and closed my eyes for a while. It gave me a backbone and direction for the conversation to come. Before the conversation, I organized my own. Numbers on a grid sheet. I wrote down how much I'd paid as $1,300 a month since I arrived. I added up extra groceries, medicine, gas for taking my grandson, all without a receipt. I listed hours spent cooking, cleaning, and doing the invisible tasks of the day. I did something simple. I converted Grandma's little help into the actual cost of the service. I printed 2 copies and put them in an envelope with my name on top. On my phone, I saved contacts for David and the new bank manager. I took 3 deep breaths as my physical therapist taught me, and I sent a message inviting me to a family meeting. In the living room, in the afternoon, I put water on the table and stacked the papers. Ashley opened with a summary of the shared management plan. Marcos said he loved me and wanted only the best for everyone. I thanked him, took my figures, and read them slowly, line by line. I explained the value of my free work and the money already given. I showed him the trust Harold left and the protection clause. I said the ticket is mine, the prize is mine, and the decision is mine, and that from that night on, the model of the house would change forever. They fell silent, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, on solid ground. I went out to explore the neighborhood, wearing old sneakers and a thick coat. The senior community had a different energy than Marcus's house. There, everyone minded their own business, but there were exchanges of glances, sincere good mornings. I saw women tending their gardens, men playing cards on the communal porch. I stopped for coffee in the common dining room, and I felt that no one looked at me as a burden. I talked to a neighbor named Margaret, who was also a widow. She told me she'd sold the farm because her children wanted to make all the decisions for her. We laughed nervously because her story sounded so similar to mine. I left with an invitation to Monday's yoga class. That first night alone in my apartment, I cooked just for myself. A simple soup, bread warmed in the oven, and the TV tuned to a soap opera. I ate slowly, in no rush to fix anyone's plate. I didn't have to wait for anyone to arrive, nor listen to a lecture about spreadsheets. I opened the window and felt the cold wind hit my face. I took out my notebook and wrote, "Today, my new life began." Sleeping without the sound of doors slamming was a relief. It was silence, but no longer the silence of mourning. It was the silence of choice. On Monday, yoga class with Margaret. I hadn't stretched like this in decades. My muscles were complaining, but each breath seemed to wash away some of the accumulated grief. Afterward, we drank chamomile tea with other women. One of them, Jean, shared that she had also been exploited by her family. She said she gave half of her retirement to her son-in-law. Another woman, Ruth, babysat her grandchildren every day without ever being recognized. Hearing those stories filled me with a mixture of sadness and strength. I realized I wasn't alone, that this kind of abuse was all too common, and that speaking out loud could help so many people. Midweek, I received a call from a reporter. He wanted to know more about my decision to leave my son's house. He asked if it hurt to expose my own family. I replied that it hurt more to be silenced within it. I explained that it wasn't revenge, it was survival. I told him that women my age are often seen only as a burden, and that we need to remind everyone we are still in charge of our own lives. He was silent for a few seconds and then said that my words had moved him. In the Sunday paper, my photo appeared with the caption, "Independence at 67. It was strange to see me there, but also liberating. Ashley texted me after the report. She said I had publicly humiliated the family. She spoke of disappointment, hurt, and scars that wouldn't heal. I read it, took a deep breath, and simply wrote, "Respect doesn't humiliate, is exploitation what humiliates." Marcus called the same day, his voice breaking. He apologized, saying he'd let his wife's pressure get the better of him. I replied that I understood, but that understanding didn't mean accepting, and that now the relationship would only exist with clear boundaries. He cried, I cried too, but I didn't change my mind. Boundaries aren't a lack of love, they're a way for it to continue existing. I started going to the community library. I'd always loved reading, but at home, there was never enough time or space for it. I borrowed history books and light novels. I sat by the window and lost track of time. It was like rediscovering a part of myself that had been dormant. On the bulletin board, I saw ads for computer classes and group travel signups. I decided to sign up for both. I didn't want my new life to be just rest. I wanted to learn, move, take up space. That was what I'd always been denied. Space. At the end of the month, I sat down with David, the lawyer, review my finances. He showed me the organized, sound, and sensibly applied numbers. I asked him if I could donate some to senior causes. He said yes, that there were ways to do so without compromising my stability. I chose to support a support center for victims of family financial abuse. I also set aside funds for scholarships for the grandchildren of women in the community. Doing this gave me a sense of justice greater than any number. It was like transforming my pain into protection for others. Harold would have approved, of that I was certain. I left the office feeling light. I bought a small, used light blue car. I drove down the Cedar Falls road with my hands firmly on the steering wheel. I felt the cold wind blow through the open window and smiled to myself. The radio played an old song Harold and I used to dance to. I remembered him, but this time without crying. It was a good feeling, no longer a burden. I stopped in an open field, got out, and took a deep breath of the cold air. There, I promised myself I would never again accept being diminished. Not by my son, not by my daughter-in-law, not by anyone. The road now was mine. On Saturday, I brought apple cake to the community gathering. People praised it and asked for the recipe. I laughed and said it was written down in my notebook, a family heirloom. I played the guitar with other neighbors even though I messed up a few chords. It was a simple evening without luxury, but one of belonging. On the way home, I looked up at the starry sky and thought, Harold, I did it. I was no longer a shadow in someone else's house. I was a light in my own life. And this time, no one could extinguish it. I started attending the neighborhood church again, something I hadn't done in years. The routine of cooking and cleaning for others consumed me so much that I no longer had time to pray. On Sunday, I sat on the wooden bench and slowly felt peace come over me. Some women recognized me from the news report and came over to talk. They said they felt represented, that they now had the courage to question. I listened attentively to each story, feeling my struggle take on collective meaning. One of them hugged me tightly and said, "You spoke for us." At that moment, I realized my prize wasn't just money. It was the chance to transform my story into a voice for so many others who had been silenced. I bought a new, more modern cell phone to learn how to use technology better. In the community computer, the young volunteers patiently taught me. I discovered how to make video calls and, for the first time, spoke to a childhood friend who lives in Florida. She cried when she saw me, saying she thought I'd disappeared. I realized how isolated I'd become in recent years, living in the shadow of Marcus's house. Not anymore. I could call, write, post, and use technology not to monitor my life, but to expand it. I felt free, almost like a teenager again, learning something from scratch. It was good to know I could still grow. I also decided to start cooking again, but only for myself and for those I chose. I bought fresh ingredients, tried new recipes. One night, I made lasagna and invited Margaret and Jean over for dinner. We sat in my small living room, laughed and talked until late. I didn't need to ask permission. I didn't need to prove my usefulness. It was my kitchen, my table, my invitation. In the end, they washed the dishes with me, each with a dish towel. We laughed like little girls, and I realized how small choices build happiness. It was simple, but it was true. One day, I received a letter from my granddaughters. They said they missed me, that the house felt strange without me. Their handwriting trembled, and I knew they had written it without their mother knowing. I cried, reading it, but I also felt strong. I responded with another letter, telling them I was fine, that I had a happy home now. I told them I loved them and that they would always have a place with me. I promised that, when possible, they would come and sleep in my new home. The hope of showing them a respectful environment encouraged me. I wanted them to learn early that women should not be exploited, not even in the name of family. In the community, I suggested creating a support group for seniors, a place where we could talk about abuse, hardships, and victories. Some thought it was bold, others thought it was necessary. Within a few weeks, we had a bi-weekly discussion group. Each meeting brought tough stories, retirements taken away, emotional blackmail, forced loneliness. But it also brought solutions, strategies, and courage. I felt that Harold, in some way, was guiding me through this. It was as if his care, embodied in the trust, was now expanding to others. With each meeting, we emerged stronger. One night, I dreamed of Harold. He was sitting in the armchair with that calm way of folding his hands. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with pride. I woke with tears in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. It was as if he'd confirmed it. I was on the right path. I took out my notebook and wrote, "Life goes on, but love never ends." This thought stayed with me all day, and it gave me a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if I'd finally found my place in the world again. At the end of the second month, Marcus visited me alone. He was dejected, his gaze downcast, his voice uncertain. He said he recognized his mistakes that he had let Ashley dominate him. He apologized, not out of convenience, but with sincerity in his tone. I listened, but said that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. I explained that our bond could only exist in a new way, based on respect. He nodded, tears in his eyes. We went for a walk in the community garden, side by side, unhurried. For the first time in years, we spoke as true mother and son. Ashley, on the other hand, never showed up. She sent cold messages trying to blame me. I responded sparingly with short, firm sentences. I no longer carried the burden of justifying every move. She still tried to get to me, but now her words didn't hold me back. It was like listening to rain tapping on the window. Noise, but no impact. I had finally learned to differentiate love from control. And that was one of the greatest victories of my life. Understanding that I wasn't obligated to submit to someone who didn't respect me. I was invited to give a talk at the city's community center. The topic was autonomy in old age. I stepped onto the simple stage, my microphone trembling, but when I began to speak, my voice came out firm. I told my story without embellishments, just as it had happened. The audience listened in silence, some crying, others smiling. At the end, I received a standing ovation. Not for the money, but for the courage to start over. At that moment, I realized I wasn't just a survivor, I was an inspiration. I left the auditorium with several women surrounding me. They said, "You spoke about what I've experienced and never had the courage to tell." I exchanged phone numbers and hugged each of them. I felt a network blossoming there, invisible but strong. It was as if each of them had found a glimmer of hope. I returned home, moved, grateful for the opportunity. I wrote in my notebook, "The greatest wealth I have is being able to help." I ended the evening with a hot tea on the porch, and my heart was at peace. That week, my granddaughters came to visit me for the first time. Ashley didn't approve, but Marcus brought them anyway. I baked chocolate cake, bought soda, and rented a movie. The girls ran around the apartment exploring every corner. They said, "Grandma, this feels like a real home." I held back tears because I understood the weight of that statement. That night, they slept cuddled together on the sofa bed, smiling. I watched, grateful for the chance to show them another world. That was it. My new life wasn't just mine. It was theirs, too. Morning after my granddaughter's visit, I woke up early and made pancakes. They sat at the table laughing, spreading maple syrup on their plates. Marcus ate breakfast with me in silence, but I could see a mix of guilt and relief in his eyes. When they left, the youngest hugged me and said, "Grandma, I want to live here with you." My heart sank, but I just smiled and told them the house would always be open. It was hard to close the door after they left, but at the same time, I felt like I had left an important mark. The girls had seen that life could be different, fairer, lighter. This gave me the strength to carry on. I began to organize my routine with more discipline. I went to yoga classes twice a week and walked every morning. On Wednesdays, I participated in the seniors' conversation circle. On Saturdays, I had someone over for dinner. It wasn't a life full of luxury, but it was structured around my own choices, and every little choice reminded me that I was in control. A shopping list, choosing flowers for the balcony, even deciding what to watch at night. All of this had previously seemed trivial. Now it was a victory, because no one used my hands without asking or my money without permission anymore. One day, I received a letter from the bank confirming the transfer of my winnings. The number of zeros almost scared me. But instead of thinking about purchases, I thought about security. I asked David to strengthen the trust and create a lifelong fund for me. I wanted to ensure that for the rest of my life, I would never again depend on anyone. I also asked to set aside a portion for annual donations. He patiently explained each step, and I wrote it all down in my notebook. I left the bank feeling protected. It wasn't about showing off. It was about never being held hostage again. This was my greatest achievement. I returned to Murphy's Corner store on a Friday, as I always did. Jimmy, the clerk, smiled when he saw me enter. He asked if I still wanted my usual ticket. I said yes, because tradition is always there. He joked, "After winning 53 million, do you still play?" I smiled and said yes, because it wasn't about the money, it was about the ritual. I bought the ticket and kept it in the same zipper in my wallet. It was like keeping Harold's memory, our marriage, our history alive. And in a way, it was also about thanking the luck that had set me free. I left the store feeling lighthearted, as if it were just another Friday. Community, I was asked to help organize the library. I accepted immediately, having always loved books. I spent afternoons cataloging, labeling, and cleaning shelves. It was volunteer work, but it made me happy. There, I met young people who came to study and older people who just came to chat. I exchanged reading recommendations, lent novels, and received them back with thank you notes. The library became a meeting place, and I felt part of something bigger. It was gratifying to see people reconnecting through stories, and to think that I was writing my own in real time. I was invited to speak on a local radio station about my experience. I was nervous, but I accepted. In the studio, the host asked me what the biggest lesson I'd learned from it all was. I replied without much thought, "Never accept being treated like a burden. Elderly people are life, not a burden." He was silent for a few seconds and then said that this needed to be heard. Listeners sent emotional messages, sharing their own stories. Some said they would call their mothers that night. I left the station certain that my words were resonating, and that my individual struggle had already become a collective one. It was as if I had planted seeds. On the way home, I stopped at the florist. I bought lavender, daisy, and basil seedlings. I carefully planted them on the porch, working the soil with my bare hands. The scent of lavender filled the air, bringing calm. The flowers colored my space, transforming it into a true home. Every time I look at them, I remember that life can blossom again. Even after so much pain, beauty finds its way. And seeing those plants grow filled me with hope. It was as if I were being reborn, day after day. One late afternoon, Margaret invited me for a walk to the lake. We talked about life, laughing at silly things. We sat on a bench and gazed at the calm water. She said she admired my courage to start over. I replied that courage doesn't come from nothing. It comes from necessity. I told her I had no choice but to hold my head up high. She squeezed my hand and said, "And yet, not everyone can do it." In that moment, I realized I had truly done something great, not just for myself, but for showing that it is possible. And the lake seemed to reflect this peace. I received an unexpected call, an invitation to participate in a documentary. The topic was elder financial abuse. I was surprised, but then I thought, why not? I accepted on the condition that I wouldn't reveal details that would harm my granddaughters. On the day of the shoot, I told my story, looking into the camera as if it were a friend. I spoke of the exhausted nights, the feeling of captivity, and the turning point. The crew listened to me in silence, writing down every word. When they finished, one of the producers was quietly crying. Then I realized my story had real power, and that that it could help even beyond my hometown. When the documentary aired, I received dozens of messages, some from strangers, others from distant acquaintances. Many said they finally understood the gravity of financial abuse. Others said they were deciding to change their lives after watching. I was moved by each testimony. I never thought an ordinary woman from Cedar Falls could make such an impact, but I understood that strength isn't in fame, it's in truth. And my truth, even simple, had reach. It was as if the world was saying, "You did the right thing, Dot," and that gave me peace. One freezing morning, I received a basket of fruit at my door. A handwritten card read, "Thank you for showing that there's still a way out." There was no signature. I smiled to myself, wondering who could have sent it. Maybe someone who heard my interview or a woman from the community. It didn't matter. The gesture spoke 1,000 words. I picked up an apple and ate it slowly, looking out the window. It was like a gift from life, small but full of meaning. I felt profound gratitude, and I prayed quietly, giving thanks for being alive and free. The following month, I hosted a tea party at my apartment. I invited some neighbors from the community, each bringing a different dish. The table was colorful: cakes, pies, fruit, and cookies. As we drank tea, stories began to emerge naturally. We laughed at the good memories and also cried over the shared pain. I realized that many there had been silent for years, without a space to speak. My apartment became that space, and I felt proud to be able to open the doors to this. It was more than a gathering. It was an act of resistance and collective care. I received an invitation to speak at a local school. The teachers wanted me to share my story with the high school students. I was surprised, but I accepted. I spoke about respect, aging, and the value of people. I explained that the elderly are not just stories of the past, but still have a present and a future. The young people listened attentively, some asking curious questions. At the end, a girl said, "I'm going to hug my grandmother today in a different way." This deeply moved me. I realized that my testimony could educate even those who hadn't yet experienced old age. It was a way of planting seeds early. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus visited me again. This time he brought flowers and a calmer expression. He said he was attending therapy and trying to reevaluate his choices. I listened calmly, without interrupting. He admitted that he had let Ashley dominate his decisions and that this had hurt our relationship. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply stated that boundaries still apply. But I also said I was willing to maintain respectful contact. He cried again, and this time I hugged him. It was a different kind of hug, not one of dependence, but of two adults trying to start over. It was hard, but also necessary. Ashley, on the other hand, remained distant. Her messages were short, often cold or accusatory. I stopped insisting on. I understood that everyone has their time, and perhaps hers will never come. I no longer hold grudges. I just don't allow myself to be abused. My energy is too precious to be wasted on those who don't want to change. I chose to invest in those who respect me and bring me peace. This choice brought me a lightness I never imagined I'd feel. I stopped trying to be accepted by those who only knew how to exploit me, and that was liberating. At the library, I started leading a book club. We met bi-weekly to discuss a chosen book as a group. The conversations were rich, full of interpretations and laughter. Some young people joined and brought new perspectives. It was beautiful to see different generations learning together. The club grew so much that we needed more chairs, and I, who had previously been seen as a burden in the house, was now the meeting organizer. This gave me a sense of purpose that no Ashley spreadsheet could measure. Each page read was further proof that I had found my voice and that it now echoed in many directions. One night, I sat down to review my finances alone. I grabbed my notebook and calmly reviewed each entry. I realized I didn't need extravagances, just security and independence. I decided I would use some of the money to fund community projects. Nothing huge, but enough to change lives around me. This included support for exploited elderly people and scholarships for underprivileged youth. I felt at peace when I wrote those first. It wasn't about showing power. It was about giving back. And I realized that the more I gave meaning to money, the lighter I felt. It was as if it had come not just for me, but for many. A reporter from the state newspaper contacted me. He wanted a longer interview, focusing on the fight against abuse. I accepted, but asked that my granddaughter's identities be protected. I shared details of my experience, the exhausting nights, and the turning point with the lottery. He listened attentively and said my story could inspire changes in public policy. When the article came out, I received invitations to participate in community councils. I was surprised, but I agreed to collaborate, not to be seen, but to ensure that other dots wouldn't go through the same thing. It was as if my life had gained a second mission, and that gave me strength every day. At one of these councils, I heard stories even more harrowing than mine. Elderly people were kicked out of their homes, others tricked into signing documents they didn't understand. Some lost everything because they trusted too much in those who were supposed to protect them. It hurt to hear, but it also reinforced my conviction. I decided to create, together with other women, a reporting and support group. We called it Voices of the Elderly. Soon, we had packed meetings and received support from volunteer lawyers. I, who had previously been afraid to speak out, even in my own home, was now helping others speak out. This was one of the greatest victories I've ever had. It was like transforming pain into a collective shield. Through it all, I never stopped taking care of myself. I continued with yoga, walks, and regular doctor appointments. I bought new comfortable clothes that reflected my style, not to please anyone, but to feel good. I dyed my hair a lighter shade just for a change. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a more alive version of myself. It wasn't just appearance, it was the way I saw myself. I was no longer the woman hiding behind a controlling daughter-in-law. I was Dot, in charge of her own life, and this was reflected in every detail. One Sunday, I organized a short trip with friends from the community. We rented a van and drove to a state park. We spent the day hiking trails, picnicking, and laughing endlessly. As I sat down on a rock to rest, I looked around. All those women, once scarred by pain, were now celebrating together. I felt immense pride in being there, in having it this far. The sun was setting behind the trees and seemed to illuminate our reunion with life. It was proof that it's never too late to start over, and that freedom tastes like the wind on your face. I took a deep breath and silently gave thanks. One day, I received an unexpected call from a national radio station. They wanted me to participate in a live program about stories of overcoming adversity. At first, I hesitated, nervous just imagining speaking to so many people. But then thought about how many people might feel encouraged by hearing my voice. I accepted the invitation, and on the day of the program, I sat in front of the microphone, palms sweaty. I told my story as simply and truthfully as possible. I explained how financial abuse disguises itself as help or family agreement. I said that before I knew it, I was living in emotional captivity inside my son's house. At the end, the host said that thousands of people called to thank me. I cried in the studio, but they were tears of relief and victory. After the interview, I started being invited to community events. At first, I found it strange because I'd always been a reserved woman, but I realized that my experience had become a reference for many people. I began preparing short talks, always with practical examples. I showed how to keep documents, report abuse, and seek help. I didn't use difficult words, only what I'd learned firsthand. People would come up to me later to thank me, saying they finally understood their rights. This filled me with purpose. I felt that what hurt me was also serving to heal others, and that's priceless. One day, I ran into Ashley on the street by chance. She was entering a store, and our eyes met. For a few seconds, I felt that old weight on my chest again. But soon, I realized I was no longer afraid of her. She lowered her eyes and walked past without saying anything. I kept walking, steady, without looking back. In that moment, I realized that it wasn't just physical or financial. It was also emotional, not depending on the approval of those who had hurt me. I continued on my way with light steps, and I never again dreamed of the basement she had planned for me. My relationship with my granddaughters grew ever closer. They loved coming over to sleep over, playing on the porch, and reading my books. I taught them simple recipes like pancakes and buttermilk biscuits. We also talked about respect, gently but firmly. I wanted them to grow up understanding that love doesn't mix with exploitation. When they left, they hugged me tightly and said they wanted to come back soon. I knew this bothered Ashley, but I didn't care. My bond with them was stronger than any barrier, and I was sure they would one day understand the full truth. This gave me peace. At the community council, I suggested a public campaign about financial abuse. We garnered support from local radio stations, newspapers, and even the city government. The slogan was simple: respect has no age. We distributed pamphlets, organized lectures, and discussion groups. Many people began seeking help after this campaign. Elderly people who had previously kept quiet began reporting abuse. Some even managed to recover part of what had been taken from them. Seeing this movement emerge deeply moved me. It was as if my every step was multiplying voices, and I felt Harold smiling somewhere. One Sunday, I went to the lake alone with my notebook and a bottle of water, sat on a wooden bench and gazed at the reflection of the trees. I wrote entire pages about my journey. I noted fears, pains, triumphs, and hopes. When I finished, I realized I was no longer writing as a victim. I was writing as someone who had overcome. It was a new, almost strange yet wonderful feeling. I closed the notebook and felt an immense lightness, as if I had left some of my weight there in that calm water. I returned home in peace. Some friends in the community suggested turning my notes into a book. At first, I laughed at the idea, thinking it was overkill. But then I realized it could be another way to help. I started organizing the stories chapter by chapter. I wrote at night with a cup of tea by my side. I didn't want fame, just to record what I experienced for other women to read. Each line reminded me of how I survived and started over. And the more I wrote, the more proud I felt. It was like immortalizing victory on paper, and this idea excited me. In the community, I also organized a cooking workshop. I taught simple, practical, and inexpensive recipes for everyday life. The women loved it. We laughed a lot over pots and pans and spices. We discovered together that cooking could be therapy. Each dish had a story. Each spice reminded me of someone. I felt useful again, but this time by choice, not obligation. And that difference changed everything. At the end of the workshop, we ate what we prepared together. It was a night of true, not forced, bonding. And I went home happy. Marcus continued to visit me occasionally. There was still distance, but there was also effort on his part. I noticed his conversations were more mature, less full of excuses. He talked more about his girls, his work, his life. I listened, but I also shared my achievements. I was no longer just a mother listening, I was a woman telling her own story. This balance felt good. I no longer depended on him, and it freed us both. Perhaps this was the beginning of a healthy relationship, and I accepted it as is, unhurriedly. In the winter, the community organized a simple dance in the central hall. They played old music, modest decorations, and colorful lights. I wore a blue dress I bought especially for the occasion. When I arrived, several people greeted me affectionately. I danced with ladies, gentlemen, and even alone at times. As I spun slowly on the dance floor, I thought about how my life had changed. Before, I barely had time to breathe. Now I danced freely. It wasn't about being young again. It was about feeling alive. And that night gave me the certainty that I still had a lot to live for. The following week, I was invited to speak at a local university. The social work students wanted to hear my story. I was surprised, but I accepted. I walked into the room and saw dozens of attentive young people. I explained how financial abuse can be subtle and hidden within family arrangements. I explained how easy it is for an elderly person to become emotionally isolated. The students asked many questions and wrote down every detail. At the end, one student said, "I will dedicate my career to protecting people like you." I left with tears in my eyes. It was proof that my pain had become a seed of change. I also started traveling more. Nothing luxurious, just short getaways to nearby cities. I enjoyed walking different streets, trying new foods, visiting local markets. Each trip reminded me that life doesn't have to be vast to be beautiful. It was the simple things that fulfilled me. A view, a conversation, a coffee in an unfamiliar place. I wrote everything down in my notebook as if it were a diary of discoveries. And every time I returned home, I felt more complete. Traveling alone, without asking permission, was an immense pleasure. I felt like I owned my own time, and that was priceless. On one of these trips, I met a group of women from another community. They told me stories similar to mine. We spent hours talking about abuse, new beginnings, and achievements. They invited me to give a talk to their group. I accepted immediately, happy to be part of it. When I arrived, I was greeted with warm hugs. I shared my experience and listened to each of theirs. I left that meeting certain that we were forming a larger network. It wasn't just Cedar Falls. It was a movement that was beginning to spread. Meanwhile, my granddaughters kept coming to visit. Each time, they brought more questions, more curiosity about my new life. They loved my stories, my plans, my books. One of them said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." I held back tears, but my heart nearly burst with joy. I understood that I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was showing future generations the value of autonomy. And that was the most beautiful legacy I could leave. They were learning, by example, that respect is non-negotiable. And that gave me peace. I decided to write a letter to myself to keep. In it, I thanked myself for having the courage to start over. I wrote about the fear, but also about the strength I found. I listed my achievements, my home, my freedom, my recovered voice, and I ended by saying, "You won." I kept the letter in a drawer, along with the photos with Harold. It was like a record for the days when I might forget my own victory. That way, I would always have something to remember. Writing it was like closing a cycle and making room for many more. One cold afternoon, I received a visit from an out-of-state journalist. He wanted to write a book about stories of elderly people who reinvented themselves. He asked if he could include mine. I thought for a few seconds and agreed, as long as my granddaughters were protected. We talked for hours and he recorded my entire story. At the end, he said my story was one of the most remarkable he'd ever heard. I was moved, but also at peace. I didn't want fame. I just wanted other people to understand that there is a way out. If my story could help someone gain courage, it was worth it. And that's how I agreed to be part of something bigger. Time passed and I realized how balanced my routine now was. There were days of silence, days of movement, days of sharing. No suffocating rush, no imposed orders. I decided everything at my own pace. Sometimes I still remembered the humiliations, but not with pain. It was more like a distant memory, no longer holding power over me. The past had taken its place, and the present was full of my own choices. This gave me a sense of constant victory, as if each day were a silent prize. For Christmas, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. I invited some friends and Marcus and his girls. Ashley didn't want to come, and I didn't insist. The table looked beautiful, filled with simple, colorful dishes. The granddaughters helped decorate the tree with baubles and lights. We sang Christmas carols, laughed and toasted. Marcus, moved, thanked me for opening the doors. I simply said that family only exists when there is respect. He agreed with tears in his eyes. It was a different Christmas, without luxury, but full of truth. On New Year's Eve, I sat on the porch watching the fireworks in the distance. I held a glass of champagne and closed my eyes for a moment. I thought about everything I'd experienced in the past few months. From the silenced Dorothy to the independent Dot, there was a chasm, and I had crossed that chasm alone, step by step. It wasn't luck, it was courage. And I knew Harold would be proud. I toasted to my new life, my freedom, and the future. And I promised myself never to let anyone put me down again. Because now I knew I'm worth a lot. In early spring, I received the news that the documentary I'd appeared in would be broadcast on a national network. I was nervous because I didn't know what it would be like to see my life exposed like that. But when I watched it, I felt proud. The editing was respectful, showing reality without exaggeration. Soon after, letters began arriving from elderly people across the country. Each letter told a story of struggle, pain, and also hope. I read them one by one, moved and responded whenever I could. It was as if we'd created a silent chain of support, and I felt my voice now echo far beyond Cedar Falls. This gave me even more certainty that I'd made the right choice. I then decided to open a small community foundation with part of my money. The focus was to support seniors suffering financial and emotional abuse. With the help of David and some volunteers, we structured everything simply. The space offered legal advice, discussion groups, and small assistance services. On the opening day, I saw many people arrive shyly, almost embarrassed. But soon they began to speak, sharing their stories. It was exactly what I wanted, a place where no one would be silenced. I cut the symbolic ribbon with trembling hands, but my heart filled with pride. And in that moment, I felt that the cycle of my pain had transformed into light. I had become a bridge for others to begin again. My granddaughters came to visit the foundation with me. They were delighted to see the space filled with photos and posters. They asked why I had done it. I replied that it was so no one would have to go through what I had. They smiled and said, "Grandma, you are brave." Those words warmed me more than any award. I thought that perhaps this was the greatest legacy I could leave, to show my granddaughters that it is possible to resist and rise again, that dignity has no age, and that life can begin again at any moment. Over time, I noticed that even my health improved. My exams were better, my sleep was better, and my appetite returned. It was as if my body had also embraced this new phase. The stress I'd carried for years gradually disappeared. The headaches disappeared and my blood pressure stabilized. I felt lighter, more energetic, and more alive. It was amazing how freedom also heals the body. And every morning I woke up weightless was a gift. It was like being born again at 67, and I enjoyed every second. At one of the foundation's meetings, a woman told me something I'll never forget. She said she'd considered giving up because she saw no way out. But after watching my radio interview, she decided to ask for help. Now she was getting back on her feet, slowly getting her life back on track. She held my hand tightly and said, "You saved my life." With her, I cried along because I never thought I'd hear anything like that. That sentence resonated deeply with me. I understood that my suffering wasn't in vain. It had served to save others, and that gave me the strength to carry on. One quiet afternoon, I decided to visit the cemetery where Harold lay in state. I brought fresh flowers and sat beside the headstone. I recounted out loud everything that had happened. I spoke about the lottery, the new house, the granddaughters, the foundation. As I spoke, I felt an immense peace, as if he were listening. I said I missed him, but that I was fine, and that I was doing what he had always asked of me, never to let myself be erased. I left with tears in my eyes, but also with a light heart. It was as if I had closed another cycle, and Harold was still present in my every step. In the summer, the community organized an outdoor festival. There were food stalls, live music, and games for all ages. I set up a small foundation tent to promote the work. Many people approached, curious to learn more. Some seniors were moved to hear that help was available. Others shared their stories right there amidst the festivities. It was a day full of life, joy, and awareness. That night, I returned home exhausted but fulfilled. I felt I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and that my life now had a greater purpose. Marcus continued to approach, his steps slow but steady. He began taking the girls more often without relying on Ashley's approval. I realized he was trying to rebuild our relationship differently. There was still hurt, but there was also genuine effort. I maintained boundaries but accepted his gestures. With each visit, our conversation became more natural. It was as if we were learning to know each other again, not as a dependent mother and a distant son, but as two adults. This process was painful, but also beautiful, and it filled me with hope for the future. One summer night, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine. I looked up at the starry sky and thought about everything I had built. From the depths of the basement planned for me to the illuminated porch of my house. The contrast was so great it almost felt like another life, but it was the same life, transformed by the courage to say, enough is enough. I smiled to myself, feeling the warm breeze on my face, and I thought, Dot, you won. I didn't need crowds to cheer. I just had to acknowledge it myself, and in that moment, I did. It was the greatest victory of all. That fall, I received the printed copy of the book that included my story. I leafed through the pages slowly, my hands trembling with emotion. Seeing my name there, among so many other stories of courage, made me cry, not because I wanted recognition, but because it was proof that I existed. For years, I had felt invisible, reduced to tasks and spreadsheet numbers. Now my life was recorded on paper, impossible to erase. I placed the book prominently on my living room shelf. It was a reminder that I was no longer a shadow. I was history, and no one could take that away. With the foundation up and running, I began receiving invitations to travel. I went to other cities to speak with senior groups, sharing strategies. Each meeting was an exchange. I shared my story and received dozens of others. And I realized how much bigger the problem was than I'd imagined. But I also saw the incredible strength that existed in old age. We weren't a burden, we were a powerhouse. Each trip filled me with hope. And when I returned home, I brought new friendships with me. It was as if my support circle grew constantly, and that strengthened me. On one of these trips, I attended a conference on seniors' rights. I sat alongside experts, lawyers, and social workers. When it was my turn to speak, my heart raced. But as soon as I opened my mouth, the truth flowed naturally. I told my story simply, as I always have, and I saw genuine respect in the audience's eyes. At the end, I received what struck me most was one sentence. A woman in the audience said, "You are living proof that it's never too late." I kept that sentence as a medal because it summed it all up. Meanwhile, my home remained my refuge. The flowers on the porch grew strong, bringing color and fragrance. Each morning, I watered the plants as if giving thanks to life. My granddaughters painted pictures to stick on my refrigerator. Marcus, now more present, came to lunch with me occasionally. We no longer talked about hurt feelings, but about the future. It was the beginning of a reconciliation, slow but true. I accepted it unhurriedly because I no longer lived in need. My foundation was firm, and that made all the difference. At the end of the year, I received a community award for Inspiring Citizen. I walked onto the stage with shaky legs but a calm heart. I said few words. I thanked them and reaffirmed that dignity is not a favor, it is a right. Applause echoed, but what struck me most were the hugs afterward. Each person who hugged me said, "You gave me courage." That was worth more than any trophy. It was proof that my struggle was resonating, and that I hadn't just reclaimed my life, I had helped transform others as well. That was my true prize. The next night, I sat on the porch with my notebook on my lap. I wrote the last page of that chapter of my life. I wrote, "I won the lottery, but the greatest prize was regaining my freedom." I closed the notebook, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. I thought of Harold, of Marcus, of the girls, of all the women I'd known, and I felt an enormous peace, the kind you can't explain. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about dignity, and I knew I'd accomplished my mission. I smiled to myself and said quietly, "Dot, you won." This time, it was final.